And we're going to start kind of the last third of the class today. We started out talking about evolution, and we've been talking about biodiversity. We've looked at 4 of the 5, or 5 of the 6, depending on how you look at it, big groups. We've looked at bacteria, archaea, protists, fungi, animals. And for the rest of the class, we're going to consider plants, and we're also going to study ecology. And we do plants on purpose at the end of the semester because that way, potentially we can see some living plants. So depending on what type of success we have, what the weather is like, you may have an assignment or 2 where you're going to have to go outside and collect a plant and show me a plant later. Not today, but later, being in 2 or 3 weeks when the weather's nicer and we actually have some leaves. So let's think about plants, and remember that plants are in that big clade Archaeplastida. And besides the plants, there's the red algae are in that clade, and then the green algae. And there's 2 groups of green algae, the chlorophytes and the charophytes. And the charophytes are generally considered to be the closest relatives of the true plants. So if we look at a cladogram of plant relationships, down at the bottom, we have our common ancestor of all the things that are classified either as green algae or as plants. So we have an ancestral green alga. Notice alga without the E on the end is singular. And so the charophytes and actually the chlorophytes branched off in one direction, and then the organisms that we call plants branched off in the other direction. And land plants appear to have evolved about 475 to 500 million years ago. Now, if we look at plants, the plants are classified into 3 main groups. There are a group called bryophytes, and the bryophytes are also called non-vascular plants. Now, if you think about a person, in a person, the cardiovascular system, cardio is the heart, vascular refers to the blood, and then all the arteries and veins and capillaries that carry blood around your body. Vascular tissue in a plant is like our arteries and veins. It carries material around the plant's bodies. Most plants absorb water through their roots, so it carries the water up from the roots to other parts of the plant. Photosynthesis takes place in most plants, mainly in leaves. So it carries the products of photosynthesis all around the plants so that other parts of the body can use the glucose they make. Non-vascular plants don't have vascular tissue. So this means that when we look at non-vascular plants, and there are 3 big groups, liverworts, hornworts, and mosses, when we look at these 3 groups, they tend to be relatively small. They don't get more than a couple inches in size at the biggest. And this is because if you think about it, since they don't have any vascular tissue, since they can't transport materials around their body, everything has to get in and out of the cells by diffusion. So this means they're typically limited to a pretty small size. They also have to live either near water or at least in moist areas, like some of the animals that we talked about, to reproduce. The reproductive cells, there are a couple types, so I'm just going to call them that for now. The reproductive cells are released into the water, and that's where fertilization occurs. Now notice that this group is now called bryophytes. Phyte means plant, and bryo means moss. Notice that mosses are one of the 3 groups. And especially if you're not reading about plants in a textbook, if you're looking up plants online and you look up bryophytes, you might find bryophytes and the whole article that you read might just be talking about mosses, because the mosses used to be called bryophytes, and then there was a different name for hornworts and a different name for liverworts. But in recent years, most biologists have called all the non-vascular plants bryophytes. So keep in mind what we've said on several occasions before, biologists are constantly changing how they divide things up into categories. And this is an example. The other main group of plants, if we have non-vascular plants, you could probably guess, is vascular plants. Vascular plants have basically tubes in their body, similar to our arteries and veins. And they use these tubes to transport material around the body. So the advantage of this is this allows them to grow bigger. All the things that we think of as bushes or trees are vascular plants. Even relatively small things like dandelions. If you think about how tall a dandelion can get on its stalk, those are vascular plants. Now, vascular plants are subdivided into two categories. There's a group of vascular plants called the seedless vascular plants. And as the name suggests, they don't make seeds. A little bit later, we'll talk about exactly what seeds are. And there's three main groups in here. There's a group called the lycophytes, and the lycophytes are commonly called the club mosses. And there's a group called the pterophytes, and the pterophytes are ferns and another group of plants called horsetails. Now, there's a lot more ferns than there are any of the other types of vascular plants. In fact, there's more ferns than there are all the other types of vascular plants put together. So a lot of times when people talk about the not vascular plants, the seedless vascular plants, I should say, they talk about ferns, and everything else is called a fern ally because they're similar to ferns in some ways. Now, in general, we don't see a lot of non-vascular plants or seedless vascular plants around us. If you would take a walk in a park, or if you would go up to a botany exhibit somewhere, almost all the plants you would see would be vascular plants that are seed plants. And there's two main groups of the seed plants. There's gymnosperms, and sperm actually means seed, and gymno means naked. So gymnosperm have a naked seed, and naked refers to a part of the plant body, a part of the female reproductive structures called the ovule. And gymnosperms, the seed ends at the ovule. Now notice, gymnosperms are something we're familiar with. They're also called conifers, and the gymnosperms generally reproduce with structures that we refer to as cones. So if you think of pine cones, that is found on gymnosperms. Now there are male pine cones and female pine cones. You may never have known that. All the things that you're probably thinking of right now as pine cones are female pine cones. Male pine cones are very small, they're relatively soft. Female pine cones are much larger. Now, you might wonder why the female cones should be larger. Keep in mind something that we talked about back when we discussed evolution. For males in sexual selection, a small male can produce a lot of sperm. So for males, there's not necessarily much of an advantage in being large. For females, since eggs are very large compared to sperm and very expensive to make, they take a lot of material, they take a lot of energy, they take a lot of time. For a female plant, it's an advantage to be larger. So female pine cones are relatively large, male pine cones, kind of small and wimpy. I'll see if I can find some pine cones and bring in a male and a female from the same plant for you. Now, most of the plants we see around us are not gymnosperms, they're angiosperms. Angio means vessel. And again, we said sperm meant seed. So in angiosperm, the seed is contained in a vessel. And the seed is still inside an ovule, just like it is in gymnosperms. But out around the ovule, there's a big ovary. And the ovary actually makes up, once the egg gets fertilized by the sperm, we often call it pollen when we talk about plants instead of sperm, but once the egg is fertilized, the ovary develops into something that we eat. It's called a fruit. Anytime you eat something that came from a plant and it has seeds in it, it's a fruit. Even something like a tomato, which we say that a tomato is a vegetable. But if you're thinking about it in terms of the botany, in terms of the actual biology, a tomato, a cucumber, a watermelon, anything that has seeds in it is a fruit. And the part around the seeds, most of the part around the seeds, is that ovary. So now, why is the ovary there? Well, the ovary has a big advantage. If we look at gymnosperms, there aren't very many animals that eat gymnosperm pine cones. There are a few animals that do. You might imagine, if you think about a typical female pine cone, this is pretty good roughage. It'll definitely give you the fiber you need in your diet. Now, what's the advantage of having a seed that gets eaten by an animal? Well, the seed has a tough protective covering around it. So if an animal eats the pine cone, usually it can't digest all of the cone. And so what happens? The animal travels a little bit of distance. It, how to say this tactfully, it eliminates the part of the pine cone that it couldn't digest. So the seed comes out, and when the seed comes out, it's in a nice little pile of fertilizer. But if we look at angiosperms, they have a much more efficient system. Fruit is really just a bribe to get an animal to eat that seed, carry it someplace else. Think about if you've ever eaten a peach. Think about the flesh of the peach compared to the pit. The pit is much harder. If you would eat a peach pit, it's a little bit big to pass through your system, but if you were larger and you ate a peach pit, you would digest the peach, but the pit part would pass through your body. It would come out in a pile of feces, so a nice stack of fertilizer. And not only that, you would have moved the seed away from the parent plant. Remember, competition isn't good. Organisms try to reduce competition. So for angiosperms, the fruit is a nice bribe. In some cases, the fruit is just a way of getting the seed to a new place. I'm sure you all have at least a vague idea what a coconut looks like. Coconuts actually float in water. And coconuts originally were found on islands in the ocean. And coconut trees tend to grow relatively close to the shore. So as the coconut ripens, it falls to the ground, it gets into the water, and it can potentially float to a new island, which is also one of the reasons that most coconut trees are found on the beach, because if a coconut gets to a new island, it's probably not going to get too far up on the beach before it gets stranded. So when we look at this, what we see is that the seed can be for dispersal, for moving the plant, or moving the plant's offspring, I guess I should say, to a new region, or it could be for bribing an animal to do the moving for it. So either way is a possibility. Now, let's think about some of these groups of plants and let's think about what the general life cycle of a plant is, because all plants go through a very similar life cycle. So when we look at plants, depending on what type of plant you see, for most of the plants that we observe, for grass that might be growing in your front yard, for trees, whether they're conifers or whether they're flowering plants, you're looking at a body that's called the sporophyte. Now, the sporophyte gets its name because it makes spores. And notice that the sporophyte is a diploid cell. So if you would take cells from the leaf of a plant, a tree in your yard, a bush, a tomato plant you're growing for veggies, if you would take some leaf cells or some stem cells or some root cells, those cells are all diploid cells. They're 2N. The sporophyte makes some sporangia, and those sporangia form a spore mother cell that then divides by meiosis. And this makes spores. And the spores, they just have them labeled as 1N, but usually in genetics, we write that as, they have them labeled as N, but usually we write them as 1N. The spore germinates and starts to grow, and the spore forms a gametophyte. The gametophyte makes eggs and sperm, and it makes those by mitosis. So notice when we think about making eggs and sperm, like in a person or another animal, we tend to think of eggs and sperm being made by meiosis, but not in plants. The sperm fertilizes the egg. We get a zygote, which is 2N. The zygote starts dividing by mitosis and makes an embryo, which develops into the sporophyte. So if we look at the vascular plants, the sporophyte is the part of the body that we're probably seeing. The gametophyte is very small and typically remains attached to the sporophyte. So if you look at an oak tree, or if you look at a blade of grass, or if you look at a rose bush, or if you look at a fern, the cells that you're seeing are 2N. You're looking at the sporophyte. However, if we look at the non-vascular plants, if you have some moss growing in your lawn, that moss, the part that you can see is mostly the gametophyte. In the non-vascular plants, the gametophyte is the main thing we see, and then the sporophyte grows out of the gametophyte. So one difference is, what we see when we're looking at a particular type of plant. Non-vascular plants, we're probably looking at the gametophyte. Vascular plants, we're probably looking at the sporophyte. So in non-vascular plants, the gametophyte is sometimes said to be the dominant stage of the life cycle. In vascular plants, it's the sporophyte that's dominant. Now keep in mind, when we say dominant here, we're talking about dominant just in terms of what's the largest part of the life cycle. What do you probably see when you're looking at it? Which stage lasts the longest? So don't necessarily think that, it's dominant in the ways that we talk about a sports team being dominant or a person being dominant. Like when we use the word dominant back in genetics, this is another example of a use of that word that has a different meaning in biology than we might use in everyday language. So the easiest way to think about the life cycle is when the sporophyte reproduces, it makes the gametophyte. When the gametophyte reproduces, it makes the sporophyte. Now in our discussion of plants, we're going to talk about several problems that plants have. Keep in mind that the common ancestor of plants, along with the green algae, was an algae plant. An algae, I shouldn't say plant. So algae live in water. They don't live on dry land. So when the first plants moved onto dry land, they had several problems. One is gas exchange. In living organisms, and this includes you, gas exchange always occurs across a moist membrane. the membrane has to have water coating it. This is why on a cold winter day, you can see your breath when you exhale. That moisture is coming from the moisture that's in your lungs. And this moisture is necessary because gases always diffuse in and out of individual cells. And gases typically can't go through non-liquid materials very quickly. Now notice, if you're living in the ocean, having a moist environment isn't a big problem, or if you're living in a lake. But on land, there's a problem. If you've got to have the surface where gas exchange occurs coated with water, then you can potentially lose water. So this means that dehydration is a problem. So land plants have to do two things. They have to minimize how much water they do lose, and then they have to find a way to get more water to replace what they did lose, because no system is perfect, so they are going to lose a little bit. So this is going to cause a problem. There's another problem related to water. Water is a very stable environment. It takes a lot of heat energy to change its temperature. But clearly the environment on land changes more rapidly and more frequently. Think about how people are always complaining about the Chicago weather, how much it changes over the course of 24 hours. So if we look at plants, plants have to withstand changes, but not just in the air temperature, also in soil temperature and also in wind speeds. Because keep in mind, for plants, wind can cause evaporation and can cause more loss of water. Humidity. If you live in water, the humidity in water is always 100%. Nutrient availability. Some soils have more nutrients than other soils do. Light levels, how much light is available. There's not as much light available in water, but because the water filters out a little bit of the light, the amount of light available tends to be a little more constant, as opposed to, think about when we have a very dark, overcast day with dark gray flowers, as opposed to when we have a bright morning like today. So another issue is plants have to exchange materials with an external environment of air instead of water. And if a plant is in water and materials are just being absorbed from the water, plants don't need to be vascular because every part of the plant is in the water. But once you get on land, if you're a tree, you might have to transport materials from the soil up 50, 60, 100 meters. You might have to transport them high into the air. Another problem that you face without water, think about when you've been in a swimming pool. The water holds up part of your weight. It gives you some buoyancy. So plants don't have to hold their body up when they're in the water. Once you move onto the land, now you have to support your body. Now you might say, why bother to support your body? But keep in mind, if plants don't support their body, then they're going to be small plants like moss and liverworts and hornworts, because if they don't support their body, they can't grow very tall. Without some support tissues, most of the non-vascular plants, I think the biggest ones that I'm aware of are about 4 centimeters tall, which is about 1.5 inches, 2 inches. So they don't get very big. And finally, when plants reproduce, they can't just release their gametes directly into the water and let the gametes find each other. They've got to find a way to get the gametes to the other gamete. So we are going to talk about some processes like pollination. So when we look at this, what we want to keep in mind is a lot of problems with moving on to land. So for now, we're going to focus on some of the main groups, and then we're going to address some of these problems a little more directly. So the bryophytes is the name for the non-vascular plants. And when we say they don't have vascular tissue, they don't have the tissue to transport substances through their body. Now, bryo actually means moss. So this is why, recall I said a few minutes ago, originally the bryophytes were just the mosses. Now we use it to refer to all the non-vascular plants. So if we look at non-vascular plants, most of the time when we look at a non-vascular plant, the gametophytes are not going to be very obvious. Most of the time, notice how on these lines, they just have this little flat line down here. This little flat horizontal line is actually the sporophyte. And so the sporophyte is all this part down here. Remember I said the gametophyte kind of grows up out of the sporophyte. Now the gametophyte is the part that typically will stick up maybe an inch. The sporophyte part is relatively flat. So let's look at some of these groups. Keep in mind, especially with the plants, but sometimes with some of the smaller groups of animals, what we see is that you have to use your imagination a little bit when you look at their names. So let's think first about the liverworts. And the liverworts got their name because if we look at these little bulges here, when they were first discovered, it was thought that the lobes resembled the lobes of a liver. The human liver has several lobes. Now these are much, much smaller, but they kind of have the same general shape, kind of look like little flaps. Now, they got this name because in a lot of traditional folk cultures, plants are named for the part of the body that they resemble. And they're also used to treat diseases of that body part. So if you would go back to, say, the Middle Ages, if you had problems and the problems seemed to be from your liver, keep in mind we couldn't do an MRI or anything to find out, but if you had problems in your liver area, which would be right underneath your ribs, basically on the ventral side, on your front side, then one of the things that we might do, 800 years ago or so, is we would make you a poultice, or we would make you a salve. And basically we would make this out of liverworts because it was believed that when a plant was shaped somewhat similar to a body part, could be used to treat diseases of that body part. Liverworts don't really have much medicinal value, so unfortunately that didn't turn out so well. So liverworts tend to be small. The biggest liverworts are about 10 inches long. So that's about 10 centimeters long, about 2.5 centimeters in an inch, so about 4 inches long. And remember what I said, maybe half an inch, inch and a half tall. They tend to be much more common in tropical areas. For instance, if you would look in a tropical rainforest, there are liverworts on the bottom of the floor. Now the liverworts are the earliest land plants according to the fossils that we've discovered so far. And if we go back to our diagram for a moment of the relationships between plants, notice that it shows liverworts splitting off first over here on the left from the other plants. Now we do have dotted lines in here, and that's because we don't have a really good fossil record of these early plants, so that's what we think is the case, but we're not positive. If we look at the sporophyte, the hornworts, and we look at their sporophyte is shaped like a horn. these little round circular structures. Now remember what we said, when we look at the non-vascular plants, most of the plant is the gametophyte. So all the flat leafy part here is the gametophyte. The sporophyte is just that little round cup-shaped or horn-shaped structure. So in both the liverworts and hornworts, the gametophyte is the main part of the plant. The sporophyte grows out of it. Now, mosses are the most common of these groups. You might never have seen a liverwort or hornwort. And since they're 4 inches long at the most, you might not have ever noticed it. Most people have seen mosses. Here's a moss. And if you look at a piece of moss, typically looks kind of like a piece of shag carpeting. If you would go outside and you would inspect your lawn very carefully, a lot of times there's moss growing in your front yard. If you have a little patch where the grass isn't very thick, you might have moss growing on there. If the grass is real thick, there's a problem. The blades of grass are taller than the moss, so it shades out the moss. So typically you find mosses if you have an area of your lawn where the grass isn't growing real well at the moment. Now, moss are limited to damp areas. Why? Because the sperm have to swim to the eggs for fertilization to occur. So remember when we talked about amphibians. Amphibians are limited to watery areas for the same reason. And the other reason is because mosses don't have any true vascular tissue. So that means the movement of substances from the bottom of the body, from the gametophyte, that's what's right adjacent to the soil, the movement of materials from the gametophyte up to the tip of the sporophyte, or even the upper part of the gametophyte, has to occur by diffusion. And remember from 105, diffusion is very slow. It's not a very efficient way of moving things. So this really means that these non-vascular plants can't grow very big. Now, the main part of the gametophyte, the main part of the body, is a structure called a thallus. And if you're looking at a moss, this is what you'll probably see. So this is almost all thallus here. It's hard to tell from the angle they're holding at. There could be a sporophyte or two sticking up out of it, but it's not very obvious if it is. A lot of times the sporophyte is a different color. So when you look at a moss, you're mostly looking at the gametophyte. Now the reproductive structures are called antheridia and archegonia. And the antheridia produces sperm by mitosis. Remember, in plants, eggs and sperm are made by mitosis. One way to remember this is, remember, anthropology is technically defined as the study of man. You know, we interpret man there to be humans, but, you know, that's a hint that the antheridia is going to make sperm. Archegonia produce eggs by mitosis, and they both grow out of the gametophyte. Now, since this is in a moist area, the sperm are released into the water. The eggs are released into the water. The sperm swim to the eggs, fertilize the eggs. The fertilized egg develops into a zygote, and the zygote stays attached to the gametophyte. And the gametophyte starts dividing by mitosis and makes a new sporophyte. Now the sporophyte stays attached. So here's an example where you can see the gametophyte is the greenish down here, and the sporophytes stick up kind of like little mushrooms or something. But notice from the fingers, notice the scale of this. The sporophytes are only sticking up out of the gametophytes about, the height of a finger. So in this case, notice that the gametophyte and the sporophyte are typically slightly different colors. And the sporophyte has 3 different structures. Down at the very bottom of one of these mushroom-like stalks, there's a foot. And the foot is the part of the sporophyte that's actually stuck into the gametophyte. And then there's a stalk, the little string that leads from the foot up to the top, and the top is called a capsule. And notice that the sporophyte is the 2N stage, the gametophyte is all 1N. So the capsule makes spores that are haploid. Well, since the cells in the capsule are diploid, to make cells that are haploid, it has to reproduce, it has to divide by meiosis. And then these cells germinate and make the next gametophyte. And the gametophyte starts out as filamentous. Filaments are threads. So think of that mycelium that we saw with fungi. So we start out with kind of this interwoven clump of threads, and the threads branch and eventually form that thallus. Now notice that the part that we just talked about is really just a little more specific example with a little more detail of what we talked about back here, the life cycle. The main advantage here is they don't really show the gametophyte much. The gametophyte is just this kind of flatter part on the bottom here. So when we look at non-vascular plants, they're relatively simple. They're very important from a evolutionary perspective in the sense that these were the first plants to move onto land. And plants moved onto land from the water before animals did. So in that sense, animals were dependent on plants, which kind of seems logical if you think about it. We haven't talked about ecology yet, but I'm sure you all know that, in most ecosystems, plants are the kind of the bottom of the food pyramid. Animals ultimately depend on plants for organic materials and energy. And the reason that that's true is because, of course, plants can photosynthesize, animals can't. So all the molecules in your body, or any animal for that matter, all the molecules in your body started out as glucose that got made during photosynthesis in a plant's body. So plants don't necessarily need animals. Animals definitely need plants though. So are there any questions about non-vascular plants? Okay, let's look just at the beginning of vascular plants. And the key difference is vascular plants have specialized tissues, and these tissues transport water, minerals, hormones, and the products of photosynthesis around the plant body. And vascular tissue is made of 2 specialized tissues called xylem and phloem. And xylem and phloem are always located right next to each other. And the xylem and phloem that clump together are called a vascular bundle. So here's a vascular bundle. We would see something like this in, say, a corn plant. If we made a slice through the stem of a corn plant and looked at it under a microscope, for some reasons that you might be able to guess, when these vascular bundles were first seen under a microscope, the vascular bundle in corn plants were called monkey heads, monkey faces. Use your imagination a little bit here. Remember what I said, a lot of things that are named in plants and animals don't really look quite what the name is. So when we look at the xylem, what we see is that there are a couple of types of cells in xylem. There are some cells called vessels, and these are these big yellow circles. And we'll talk later, but vessels are basically dead cells. So all that's left of the plant cell is the cell wall. The cytoplasm, the nucleus, all the organelles in the cytoplasm have deteriorated. Then we have some smaller cells down here, kind of peachy colored, and these are the tracheids. And this is another type of cell. And again, these cells are used for transport. Now these cells, the kind of from the eyes on down of the monkey face, these carry materials upward in the plant. So these are the materials that carry the water that the roots absorb and any minerals that's absorbed with the water. These carry that upwards to leaves, to the flowers, to the stems. In the summer, this is what people in some parts of the world tap into. You can drill a hole and you can tap into this and you can take out some of that fluid. And you don't want to hit the vessels or the tracheids when you drill into the tree. You actually want to hit this upper part. Usually you get a mixture of both, because keep in mind this entire structure here is microscopic. If we look at this entire structure, probably looking at something about, if you think of this as a circle, probably looking at something that's about 1/100 of an inch in diameter. This upper part is made of the phloem. And the phloem transports organic materials around the plant's bodies. So it transports the products of photosynthesis from the leaves. That's the main place where photosynthesis happens. Everywhere else. If you think about it, root plants can't carry out photosynthesis. They're not even exposed to the sun. So this is where they get the glucose that they need to carry out cell respiration. Now, in the fall, what we see with a lot of plants, think about trees that lose their leaves. They recycle a lot of those organic materials. As the leaves start to deteriorate, some of the molecules that were found in those leaves go into the phloem and they're transported into the plant down to the roots to be stored. And they're stored over the winter. And then the next spring, when the plant starts to make new leaves, they're transported up from the roots to the new leaves. So the plant recycles some of the material so it doesn't have to start over from scratch every spring. So the reason you might want to go out to a tree and poke a hole in it and collect this material that runs upward in the spring is, if you collect this is what's used to make maple syrup, for instance. Now, why is it sweet? Because a lot of these materials are stored as sugars. Keep in mind, it also contains some other materials. And you could basically make maple syrup from almost any type of tree. Supposedly, maple syrup tastes better than the syrup that you get from oak trees or sycamore trees or whatever. I'm not sure if that's true. I've never tried any other type of syrup, but this xylem and phloem are crucial to how a plant works. And notice that vascular plants do have organs. They don't have organ systems. So remember, when we talked about the fungi, we said that there was one group of fungi, some of the molds, that had organs. They had those stolons and the rhizoids and the sporangia. Here, the basic organs in a vascular plant are the root and the shoot. And the easiest way to think of them is the root is the below ground part of the plant. Now, keep in mind, we're just talking about a quick and easy way to think about them. There are some plants like cypress trees that have part of their roots above the ground. But in general, the root is below ground. The shoot is the above ground portion. And the shoot a lot of times is subdivided. We talk about the stems as being an organ, the leaves as being an organ, and the reproductive structures, either the flowers, if we're talking about the angiosperms, or the cones, if we're talking about the conifers. Are there any questions about plants before we quit for today? Okay. Now, keep in mind, if you decide to make your own maple syrup at home, you do have to make sure that after you poke a hole in the tree trunk, that you actually seal that hole off. If you don't, a tree can actually get a parasitic infection. And then the bad news is you got maple syrup 1 year and then your tree's gone and you don't get the second year or the third year or the fourth year. So it actually is something that requires a little bit of technique. It's not as easy as it may look. Any questions that you'd like to ask before we leave for the day? Okay, if not, I will see you on Wednesday. Don't forget, we don't have class tomorrow. So I will talk to you on Wednesday.